Hello and welcome back to Radio Britannia with me, Alice Grant.
And me, Charlie Downs. This week we are going to be talking about some explosive developments with regards to the BBC and their doctoring of footage of President Trump during the 2020 Capitol Hill riots and the dramatic exit of Director General Tim Davie and CEO of News, Deborah Turner. After that, we are going to discuss the way in which the Home Office has been allegedly paying migrants and criminals who it has deported to set up businesses and integrate into the countries to which they have been deported. These are criminals, mind you.
Charlie, last week we spoke about the shocking misrepresentation on the BBC part of Trump. And this week, Tim Davie has resigned from his position as Director General.
Yes, alongside Deborah Turner, who is the CEO of News. And this comes in the aftermath of a dossier that was given and published by The Telegraph, suggesting that there was an endemic problem in the BBC with biased coverage of various different issues from this incident with Trump during the Capitol Hill riots in 2020, and also their coverage of the Israel-Hamas war, as well as LGBTQ issues. They have driven division on all these issues, alleges this dossier.
But some people are saying that the BBC are actually a bit too far right under Tim Davie, and that's the real issue here.
Well, this is funny. I mean, I think we're going to get into some of the reactions to these resignations because it's being painted by the likes of Ed Davie and The Guardian and Metro as being a kind of politically motivated campaign of persecution by the right. The story you're referencing is from Metro, which suggested that Tim Davie was seeking to pander to the right during his time as Director General, which, for anybody who's aware of the BBC's output over the last 5 years, during which time he has been the DG, they will know that that is total nonsense. I mean, the BBC is more woke, more progressive, more ideologically driven than ever before, in my view. I mean, we talked before on a previous episode about the politicization of their coverage of issues, but also the issues that they're actually choosing to cover, the way in which they center minority interests and minority concerns. They produce programming about how, this, that, and the other is racist. It all comes from a very particular progressive viewpoint, which I think crowds out more reasonable perspectives. And I think that's what a lot of ordinary people certainly think. And so this idea coming from certain quarters of the liberal media establishment that it is an unjust kind of campaign of persecution against the BBC are themselves caught up in that, the bubble that views the kinds of issues the BBC was seeking to centre as being normal and as being right to centre.
Yeah, I don't think there's any single British person who would argue that they were at all outwardly conservative leaning in their output. And Davie, interestingly, brought up the idea that we have to now rescue and defend our BBC from Trump. Of course, Trump is now threatening to sue the BBC against defamation. Figures purportedly 1 billion.
Yeah.
Whether he does so or not will be very interesting to see. However, one thing that is being sort of talked about is this idea that he could be perhaps influential in the next Director General. My take is that that wouldn't be a good thing. As much as I find myself aligning myself much more to Trump in terms of political views than to any of the typical BBC establishment, I wouldn't like to see our national broadcaster being in the hands of the Americans.
So you're with Ed Davie on this issue?
Definitely not with Ed Davie, but I think a measured approach is necessary. What do you think?
Well, this is what Davie came out and said. This is Ed Davie, not Tim Davie. No relation as far as I'm aware.
But you never know with the establishment.
Well, quite, yeah. But he said that exactly what you just said, which is that the running of our national broadcaster should not be so heavily influenced by foreign interests, which I also do agree with. But it's the style in which Davie comes out and says these things, because he is positioning himself as being a defender of the BBC as currently constituted, which is quite interesting from a man who is nominally in opposition to the current government. I mean, he's the leader of the Liberal Democrats, who are, slating Labour every other day, and rightly so, flanking Labour from the left in many ways. But he is identifying with and finding common cause with the BBC as it currently exists, which reveals him, as we know, to be just purely an agent of the establishment. He is not in any way a radical figure. And I'm not suggesting that he has presented himself in that way. As a matter of fact, I think that part of his whole brand is presenting himself as being a kind of, sort of middle class, middle England, acceptable face of good old, progressive values and all this kind of thing. But it shows you that the Liberal Democrats do not represent real opposition to this government. And we've spoken in previous weeks about the fracturing of the political landscape. But I think in many ways, when it comes to a party like the Lib Dems, this fracturing is an illusion because they exist to defend the very same order that is currently being upheld by the Labour government.
We're living in a time of what feels like pretty significant social change, and it makes us question things that we've even taken for granted for decades. And one of those at the moment that people are wondering about is actually money. Is the money in your bank account safe? Should you be investing elsewhere? Are we looking at a potential global crash? What will it mean for your savings? Is there a way that you could be using your money that might be outside of government control even? Well, TallyMoney is potentially one solution. So I'm delighted to say that I'm joined today by the CEO and founder of TallyMoney, Cameron Parry. What is TallyMoney?
Well, at TallyMoney, you basically get gold you can spend. So we give people an individual account in their name, everyday account. They get a sort code, an account number. They use that account just like they would pounds from their bank, but it's milligrams of gold that we brand as Tally.
Okay. Why would you do that, though? What is the benefit to the customer instead of just having a normal pound sterling account?
Gold's performance against the pound is above 11% per annum over the last 25 years on average. But we still need money in our daily lives, and we have savings. We know that it's good common sense and prudent to save up for things, not just living credit. You know, whether it's a holiday or a rainy day, your retirement planning, you need to have money in your life, basically, that you can rely on, that's dependable, that nobody meddles with, that nobody can weaponise against you, which is another element of government control when it's the government currency, which we could talk about another time. And it should be pretty simple and straightforward, and that's what we deliver at Tally. And really, we just want people to feel safe and happy with their money. There was a time when the bigger your bank balance, the more confident you felt. Now it's like, I need to do something with it. I can't leave it there. In Tally, you can.
Okay, brilliant. Cameron Parry from TallyMoney, thank you so much.
Thank you, Bev.
Yeah, do they even really have a point, the Liberal Democrats? Their point was sort of anti-Brexit for a very long time, but Labour had basically taken on that stance.
Yes.
And, you know, Davie, I think, struggling to be relevant, is now trying to champion the BBC against Trump. This really doesn't feel like a very substantial issue.
No.
I think what hopefully we see with the next Director General is someone who is far more actually prepared to stand up for what the majority of British people think.
Yeah.
And that does tend to be conservative values.
Yeah,
Sort of have always been that way. And I think that's across all spectrums as well.
yes.
What we don't want to see is more of the, you know, is this racist content?
Quite, yeah.
Or, you know, the sort of, or the shocking style of edits that we've seen, including that of President Trump.
Yeah, just
made look
lies.
like the absolute lies and misinformation.
Yeah, well, this is the question. I mean, you just mentioned the fact that there is a theory going around that the reason that Trump has threatened that he is going to sue the BBC for $1 billion is so that he can essentially exercise veto power over who the successors to Davie and Turness are. And that would be a very interesting turn of events. And once again, not one that I'm entirely comfortable with, because the Americans, you know, American influence over British politics, is it a good thing? Has it been a good thing historically? I think there's a very long conversation to be had there. We're told that they're our greatest allies, but increasingly, I don't feel that that's the case. But that's a separate issue. I mean, but you know, with that being said, a Trump pick for BBC Director General could well be quite good for this country and for the national interest. Because I think, if nothing else, sure, his pick would be very sympathetic to his brand and to his reputation. But they might also be more aligned, as you say, with the views and interests of the general British public, which ultimately is what the BBC exists to do. And so the question is, can they be trusted to put somebody like that in place of their own volition?
What I would like to see from the Americans, if anything, is just more funding into the alternative media, or, you know, to make it the new mainstream. Carolyn Levitt recently said, watch GB News, and that the BBC News is 100% fake news.
That is true.
So why not, instead of having some sort of Trump plant as Director General, we instead have greater support from the Americans to Radio Britannia.
Well, I would say even there, though, that, we don't want to be taking foreign money for any sort of aspect of our cause, in my view, because I think, as I say, American influence over British politics, the Americanization of British politics, which has really, I think, taken hold over the last 30 years. I think Blair, in a lot of ways, even back to Thatcher, though, were manifestations of this. And I don't think it's been good. I mean, I think it's turned politics into a theatrical exercise. The media has become not a kind of, not pursuers of truth, but pursuers of what is shocking and what is popular and all of this kind of thing.
That's
right.
definitely an American inheritance.
Yeah.
But I'd have to say under Thatcher, I felt quite different from under Blair. Under Thatcher, really
You were alive, were you?
we were. That we were really, one of the superpowers.
A great country.
A
No, I
great
don't disagree. I don't disagree.
Whereas under Tony Blair, it was more like, how can we sort of make ourselves like America, but just much more cringe.
Yeah, well, I mean, like
Simple.
all the things he did, the Supreme Court, and the way in which he embraced a sort of European model of human rights and all this kind of thing, which in turn was, in my view, an American inheritance. This kind of attempt to turn Britain into a propositional nation rather than a traditional nation.
But also, it's
very
a
American.
misunderstanding of who we are as well, fundamentally. And if you lack knowledge in who we are, then of course you're going to make these kind of errors.
But once again, the BBC and its defenders in The Guardian and in Metro and in the Liberal Democrats represent that order, the order that was brought into existence by Tony Blair. And, and they seek to, in a weird kind of a way, they are conservatives, which is to say they seek to preserve the status quo. And that's what's funny about those who write for The Guardian, for example, like this piece that came out today, defending the BBC from its, alleged, persecution by Trump and by the far right and all this kind of thing. They are acting. They're looking at the system as currently constituted, the culture that Britain now has, and they are seeking to preserve that. And I think for the vast majority of people, they look at the system, they look at the culture, and they think, no, we don't want to preserve this. We want radical change. And so in that way, the likes of Davie, the likes of The Guardian, are actually the regime's most loyal foot soldiers, even though they may not even realise it themselves. So moving on to our next story today, the Centre for Migration Control has revealed that the Home Office is giving mental health support, education and training, and assistance in setting up businesses to illegal migrants and foreign criminals that it has just deported. It's also paying those people to leave. And this in a time of austerity, this in a time where many British people, young British people, are wanting to set up their own businesses and receive mental health support and all of these sorts of things, and not being given access to them because the state is so incompetent and overburdened at this time.
We're facing a literal tax raid, and we've just found out that the man who was escaped from Epping Forest was given £500.
It's not even that he escaped. He was released.
He was released.
Released by accident.
Released by
come on. But you're right. He was given
£500.
Yeah.
I would very much like £500 to be able to do something good for the country.
Yeah. You and me both. And the family of the victim, by the way, the family of the 14-year-old girl who he sexually assaulted, which by the way was the spark of the Epping protests that have been ongoing for several months at this point. They said that it felt as though he was being paid, like he was being rewarded for his crime against this 14-year-old girl who was in school uniform at the time of the sexual assault.
That's horrifying.
And it's people like this, it's scumbags like that who have no business being in our country in the first place because they're illegal migrants, who are not just being paid to leave, sometimes sums as much as 2,000, by the way, it doesn't end with just 500, not just being paid to leave, but being, given this state-sponsored assistance in things like mental health and setting up businesses in the countries to which they're being deported. It's a joke.
On the face of it, it looks like they're being literally financially rewarded for crime. Because what is the difference between doing something illegal, shoplifting, and then getting literally paid by the government?
Yep.
Like a down payment.
Yeah, a handout.
A handout.
I mean, do you know,
this is made all the more worse because it is our money. It's taxpayers' money.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is a bit of a joke.
It is. And do you know what this reminds me
of? Should be sparking outrage.
Yeah.
Our taxes are going to be hiked to new heights. And it's this government which is now going to be paying people who have committed crime in this country.
Yeah.
I mean...
to leave. Yeah.
We've lost all power at this point?
Yeah, well, this is the thing. I mean, you talk to sort of high net worth individuals who are taking the decision to leave Britain. You know, many of whom they love Britain. They're very patriotic to this country. But those who have the means to do so are increasingly leaving to countries like Dubai, Singapore, places where there's very low taxes, low capital gains taxes, and this kind of thing.
Which are much safer. Their
But
children
also,
are
which are
going to be far
and
less
this is the
likely.
thing. It's taxes and it's law and order that are always cited by these people when you speak to them about why they're leaving to go to these countries. And it's perfectly understandable if you just make the calculation, rational calculation about the trajectory of this country. If you have the means to do so, in a lot of ways, why wouldn't you leave? But if you speak to a lot of these people, it's not so much, I mean, it is the rates of tax, that is a big part of it, but it's not so much just the rates, it's also what it is spent on, right? Because I think if a lot of, high net worth people, if they saw their huge tax sums being spent on things that actually benefited ordinary British people, I think they'd have less of an issue with it. I know that I would, and I'm not a high net worth individual, I'm just a regular taxpayer, but I know that I would feel far happier seeing all that tax money leave my paycheck at the end of the month if I knew that it was going towards things that were actually going to benefit me, benefit my peers, benefit my countrymen, possibly benefit my children when they come, benefit future generations, safeguard the interests of just normal British people whose families have been here for centuries. If I felt that that was the case, in a lot of ways, I'd actually feel like paying tax was a duty of mine. But actually, I think a lot of people increasingly feel that because their tax money is being spent on this, it's being spent on paying criminals, rewarding criminals for the crime of coming to the country illegally and committing crimes when they're here. I don't blame people for thinking, well, why the heck should I pay any tax?
But this is a typical leaf out of Starmer's book, really. We saw with the one in, one out policy that also, in a very different interpretation, could be seen similarly as practically incentivizing people.
Yes.
Because if you're going to be then sent to France, I mean, does it matter? Like, actually, that's not a bad deal either.
Yeah.
It just essentially is not solving the problem whatsoever.
It's not dealing with the problem at source. It's treating symptoms and this is what this government is so obsessed with doing, not interested in causes. But no, I mean, and on that, by the way, I saw somebody today say that it's less a one in, one out scheme. It's more a one in, one out, and then back in again. Because now 2 illegal migrants who've been deported under that scheme have come back in on small boats. I mean, it's just absurd. But once again, our money is spent on putting those people up in hotels, feeding them, clothing them, giving them pocket money, and eventually granting them indefinite leave to remain, at which point they get access to this, very luxurious menu of benefits that we offer any who would come here in this country. And once again, we're back to the point that this government is taxing us absolutely up to the eyebrows and then spending that money on nonsense.
One of the things I'm very conscious of this November particularly is remembering the war dead. And we're all wearing our poppies and we're all thinking of our veterans and the people who fought so bravely in 2 world wars for the freedoms that we enjoy today, our civil liberties, and for the future of this country. And we know already that it's a travesty that so many of those people who fought or gave up their lives or gave up a significant portion of their lives to fighting for Britain are not treated as well as they ought to be there on the streets, and many of them need help and they're not getting help, and how much they deserve to be put up in hotels. Another thing we're thinking of is, I guess, what it means really to have that legacy and to see it squandered by our government.
Well, did you see that chap on, I think it was Good Morning Britain, who was a 100-year-old World War II veteran, who said, he was asked some question like, do you feel that it was worth it, essentially? And he said no. He said, I don't know what I was fighting for, because the country now is worse off than it was before World War II, which is, it's a very, very profound thing for a literal veteran of World War II to say about the country as it exists now. Because I think, you listen to people who actually did fight in the Second World War, and indeed archival footage of those who fought in the First, and they weren't fighting for Keir Starmer and Tony Blair's vision of progressive modern Britain. They were fighting for England, they were fighting for Wales, they were fighting for Scotland and Northern Ireland. They were fighting for the United Kingdom, not the UK, this kind of modern affectation. They weren't fighting for liberalism. They were fighting for their country, their people, and against a real tyranny.
Or the society we'd become, which is one which is lazy in terms of actually enforcing law and order, which is weak internationally and against the problems that we face. Of course, this is an unrecognizable country to them. And that's what makes me so bitterly sad, because I really do believe, and we still believe, that this country is worth fighting for. And that we have a wonderful heritage and a wonderful tradition and a culture that we should be proud of and is worth preserving and defending. But we live in an age where not only do so many people neglect that, but actually there is a question, do we still have enough of that left, that there would be people who would be willing to go out and go to war for this?
Well, polling suggests no. I mean, there was some polling done earlier this year, which I actually wrote about in the Mail, which suggested that I think over half of under 30s would not take up arms for Britain were it to be invaded. And, it's not surprising that that's the case because, there's various different factors involved in that. One of them is the demographic reality of young people. Many young people were not born here or whose families are not from here. And so they don't feel that deep ancestral connection to the land. But there's also the fact that, what is it that Britain offers young people today? It offers them a tax bill, which is, record highs to pay for nonsense like paying foreign criminals to leave.
Yeah. Another thing, we've also been taught to feel ashamed of our national identity and to feel ashamed of our culture. Our history.
Yeah.
And that, of course, breeds this very sinister self-loathing, which we see a lot in our generation.
Yes.
Tragically.
Yeah.
And ultimately, are you going to take up arms for a country whose flag you don't recognize
or respect,
or whose nation you don't even feel as though you identify with?
No, it's such an important point because that is the other side of this. It's the way in which our institutions, from education to entertainment, have been captured by this ideology that we were discussing in the first segment about the BBC, that regards Britain and its history as being fundamentally evil and irredeemable and worthy of shame, worthy of guilt. And that message has been transmitted to our generation and younger from every mouthpiece of power. And so it's not surprising that so many young people do feel that way, that they wouldn't take up arms for this country. And so the mission of any, truly patriotic and conservative-minded political movement must be to show young people that actually the narrative we've been sold about Britain by this regime is fundamentally false. It's not rooted in truth. It's rooted in an ideology of resentment and hatred of everything great, everything beautiful, and actually reclaiming British identity for ourselves, embracing it as something that is fundamentally rooted in truth, fundamentally good, is crucial. It is essential. And we're not going to be able to repackage like British values as being what British identity actually is. It has to be rooted in ancestry. It has to be rooted in history. It has to be rooted in tradition. And I think those are things that those World War II veterans knew well because it was that world in which they lived. And it's no surprise, therefore, that they see Britain as it currently is and see something they don't recognise. It's very sad. But back to this story, though.
To sum up, I would say definitely that any money being paid to people who've committed crime in this country, at the very least, firstly, should not exist, but would feel a lot better if at least we knew that there were funds being allocated to our poor veterans who, some of which are on the streets.
Yes. And I would also add that the solution to this problem, which is to say the more broad problem of illegal immigration, is very simple, in my view. It is to deport all those here illegally, of whom there may be 2 million, do so quickly, do so without any compromise, and make it clear to those who would come here illegally that there's nothing for them here. Because Macron was right about this. Macron was right that we have an economy that incentivizes this. It's so easy for these people to come here and live a comfortable life, which is why in Restore Britain's mass deportations paper, we lay out a strategy for actually achieving this, because it can be done. It just requires the political will to do so, and the Labour government certainly doesn't have that. So I think what we would agree on, though, is that Britain is still very much worth fighting for. Absolutely. And that's proper Britain. That's not the British government, because I think that's a lot of what people think of when they are asked, would you fight for Britain? They're thinking of, would you fight for the foreign policy interests of the British government and Starmer and so on? And I know I wouldn't, right? This was the point of my article, is I would not fight for Starmer's Britain, but I would fight for Britain, properly understood.
Proper Britain.
Which is, it's my homeland. It's, I love it more than anything.
And it's made of a lot of wonderful people. And who do come to the news occasionally as well. The man who defended those who were being attacked on the train, veterans who are 100 years old, who are still sharing their wisdom with us on DME News.
Right. Yeah.
There's a lot to fight for.
There is.
I think we must never forget that.
There is.
So, and there is a lot of hope as well.
There is. And this is the point, is the right, if we want to use that label for ourselves, can't just be endless negativity. It has to be a positive vision for the future here.
Absolutely.
And, I think that it's not hard, actually, to imagine what this country could be, because it has been great before, and I think it could be great again. So, thank you very much for joining us this week, folks, and we shall see you next time.